Today, you will learn about 3 stories of women with cruel fates in Mexican prisons. Each of them faced a brutal execution, but the last story is, without a doubt, the most brutal. Do you have the courage to see it to the end? If so, leave your like, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any details. Challenge your friends to watch too. Can they handle the intensity of what's coming? Get ready, the worst is yet to come. Valeria Soto, 14 years old, San Lorenzo Penitentiary. Valeria Soto, a young woman who was just 14 years old when her life was taken by a spiral of violence and despair. From an early age, she became involved with one of the most feared criminal groups in Mexico. His childhood, marked by abuse and neglect, was the fertile ground where his anger and thirst for power grew. Death was a constant in her life, and for her, there was no feeling whatsoever in taking the life of another human being. She knew that the fear she caused gave her power, and that made her feel invincible, even at her young age. Since arriving at San Lorenzo Penitentiary, Valeria soon realized that her aggressive nature would not only be a form of survival, but her weapon of dominance. The other prisoners quickly bowed to her brutal strength, and those who tried to defy her paid with their lives. It wasn't long before she began to form a group within the prison, women willing to do whatever it took to follow her lead. The rebellions she incited were not just against the other prisoners, but against the entire system that oppressed her. She was the leader of her own faction, and in the ruthless prison environment, that meant she ruled with an iron fist. The atmosphere inside the penitentiary was increasingly tense. Valeria's fear spread like a cancer, and soon the prison system realized that she was a threat not only to the other prisoners, but also to the security of the facility. Their rebellion was not only against the other criminal factions, but against the authorities who were trying to maintain some kind of order within the penitentiary walls. On a Friday morning, what seemed to be just another exchange of favors between prisoners soon turned into a direct confrontation. Valeria, with her makeshift knife, attacked a rival prisoner, a woman who had been known for her violence. The fight was not only a demonstration of her power, but a clear warning that she controlled not only her cell, but the fear of everyone inside that prison. The woman, an older prisoner, was brutally murdered. His death sparked immediate chaos at the prison. The other prisoners were in shock, but Valeria, as always, remained impassive. The rebellion was started. A group of prisoners who admired her came together, and, under Valeria's command, they began to invade the corridors, breaking security cameras and attacking anyone who tried to stop them. The walls of the penitentiary became the stage for a bloody fight, where fear and chaos were the only constants. However, the prison's response was brutal. Control was quickly re-established, and Valeria was taken to an isolated cell. Panic spread. It was the end of his resistance, but the violence of his actions would not be forgotten. The law would now take its course, and execution was determined. The news of his execution was received with a mixture of outrage and disbelief by many. The 14-year-old girl, who seemed doomed to a life of violence since birth, would be sentenced to death by shock chair. Authorities confirmed that she would be executed inside the San Lorenzo Penitentiary, and the fact that her sentence was carried out by such a brutal method caused great commotion. Valeria's execution was an extremely rare case. Society was divided. Some saw his death as a necessary measure, others, like many in the media and human rights groups, saw it as a cruel execution, especially considering his age. Valeria's family, made up of an absent mother and a father who was unable to understand the gravity of the situation, was brought to the brink of despair. When they learned of the death sentence, Valeria's mother went into a state of denial, desperately trying to seek justice, claiming that her daughter was just a victim of circumstances and lack of opportunities. They argued that Valeria was too young to suffer such a fate, that she could still be redeemed, and that a lifetime of suffering had molded her in the wrong way. It didn't help. The system was determined to follow the law. As the execution date approached, a wave of protests took to the streets. Human rights organizations spoke out against the death penalty, especially for a 14-year-old child to be punished by death. Posters and chants asked for leniency for Valeria, calling for a chance at rehabilitation. They argued that she never had the chance to live a life away from violence, and that her story should serve as a warning about the flawed justice and education systems that led her to this point. But the government and the penal system were irreducible, and Valeria's death was, in fact, determined. The day of execution arrived. Valeria was taken from her cell and escorted by 2 guards, with an iron chain connecting her hands and feet. She walked with her gaze fixed, as if she was already so far away from everything that surrounded her that nothing else seemed to matter. The execution room was cold, silent, and the smell of fear hung in the air. Valeria was sat in a shock chair. The environment was oppressive. His eyes, however, showed no fear. She stared into space, her expression was expressionless, as if she had already accepted the fate that awaited her. Before the electric current was activated, Valeria looked directly at the guards and the officer in charge. She didn't regret it. He didn't scream. His body, still young, was connected to the chair, and electrical tension ran through his body. The process was quick, but their reactions were violent. The smell of burning and the sound of electric shock echoed throughout the room, but Valeria did not make a sound of pain, not even an expression of suffering. His body twitched, but his resistance was unbreakable until the end. She died silently, but with a perverse dignity, as a living reminder of all she was capable of doing, and the brutality of the system that condemned her. When the announcement of his death was made, the streets were silent. Valeria Soto's name has become a symbol of outrage for many and a warning that the justice system has no mercy, not even for those who are consumed by violence before they reach maturity. His story would continue to be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who, despite his youth, defied everything and everyone, even his own death. Sofia Herrera, 34 years old, El Valle Penitentiary. Sofia Herrera, at 34 years old, has always been a woman with a strong personality, but with a heart marked by cruelty. From a young age, she became involved in occult practices and forbidden rituals, seeking power through black magic. Sofia's life was a spiral of crimes and merciless choices, but what happened in her home that night would make her a household name across the country, and the crime for which she was convicted would leave scars on society forever. She lived alone with her 1.5-year-old son, a helpless little boy who had barely begun to understand the world around him. Sofia always believed she could achieve supernatural power, and this led her to commit the unthinkable. That night, she decided to perform a macabre ritual. Using her own son as a sacrifice, she beheaded him in her own home, believing it would make her stronger and closer to what she believed to be a powerful supernatural force. The boy's blood was spilled on the floor of her house, while she muttered incomprehensible words, completely obsessed with the idea of gaining power at any cost. The sound of the baby's scream still echoed in the minds of the authorities, who quickly arrived at the scene, when an anonymous tip led them to Sofia's house. When the police invaded the residence, they found the crime scene and Sofia still standing, holding the knife with her own son's blood in her hands. The shock was so great that no one imagined she was still alive. But she was injured while trying to resist arrest, and when she was shot 5 times, she was knocked down, leading police to fear she would die before being arrested. Sofia was taken to the hospital, where, despite her injuries, she managed to survive and was finally taken to the El Valle Penitentiary. By the time she arrived at prison, Sofia was already a well-known figure, and the other prisoners soon learned of the horrible crime she had committed. The news spread quickly through the prison corridors. Each of the prisoners felt disgust and hatred upon hearing the details of what Sofia had done. Her crime, involving the brutal death of her own son, generated a wave of outrage among the inmates. Sofia became the target of constant threats, but she seemed indifferent to everything. Her dismissive attitude toward the other inmates and the lives she had taken did nothing but increase tension within the prison. Some prisoners refused to accept that a woman like her, who had killed such a defenseless being, could live among them. They got together and started planning a way to make Sophia pay for what she did. Hatred for her grew every day. Some inmates came together in a kind of silent pact, promising that they would take justice on their own, as the system did not seem to be sufficient to punish someone like Sophia. What happened in the end was not a surprise to those in the know. During the night, when most of the prisoners were already in their cells, a group of them gathered and went to Sophia's cell. They dragged her out, brutally attacking her as she tried to resist. The silence in the penitentiary was broken by Sophia's screams, but no one came to her aid. The attacks became even more intense, and the prisoners' fury knew no limits. They beat her with everything they had, pieces of metal, improvised sticks, even their own fists. Sophia was attacked in every way, with punches, kicks and blows, until she could barely move. Over time, she became unconscious, but the attacks continued. The prisoners had no mercy. Every blow, every attack, was an attempt to make Sophia feel, in some way, the pain she had caused by killing her own son. There was no mercy. When the guards arrived at the cell and finally managed to control the situation, it was too late. Sophia was already lifeless, her body marked by the brutalities she had caused in the past. His death was not a liberation, but a cruel and inescapable revenge. The justice system, which had condemned her, was unable to protect her from her final fate, and within the walls of the penitentiary, Sofia Herrera paid for the horror she caused. For the prisoners, their death was the only form of justice. They would never forget what she did, and her informal but equally brutal execution was marked as one of the acts of justice within the walls of El Valle prison. Valeria Martinez, 27 years old, Cárcel de la Muerte. Valeria Martinez has always been a ruthless woman, someone who saw the suffering of others as a bargaining chip for her own gain. Since his youth, his life was marked by wrong choices, becoming involved with criminal organizations that trafficked human beings. She not only trafficked women and children, but used them to perform macabre rituals, believing that this would give her some kind of supernatural power. Her cold, calculating mind made her one of the region's most feared criminals, and her name was quickly associated with all manner of heinous crimes. When she was finally captured, her arrest created a huge uproar. Valeria was sentenced to live the last years of her life in one of the most severe prisons in the country, Cárcel de la Muerte. The prison was known for its extreme security and the brutal behavior of the prisoners. It didn't take long for Valeria to be placed in an isolated cell, away from the other inmates, but even so, her name quickly circulated through the penitentiary's corridors. Valeria's crime, human trafficking, especially the use of children for bloody rituals, repulsed even the toughest prisoners. The account of what she had done to her own 1.5-year-old son, brutally killing him during a ritual, was enough to cause immediate hatred in anyone who knew the truth. Valeria, with her disdainful expression and impassive demeanor, showed no regret. She knew that, within the walls of Cárcel de la Muerte, death could be lurking, but that was not what bothered her. She was used to dealing with death, always had been. But she didn't know that her own execution would be written by the hands of the prisoners who hated her. However, Valeria's days there were difficult. She was isolated, but news of her crimes began to spread quickly to the other cells. Some prisoners were willing to pay the price for justice, even if it meant getting their own hands dirty. Valeria's crime had left many families destroyed, and hatred for her grew every day. The other prisoners, especially those who had lost relatives because of people like Valeria, could not allow her to live another hour inside the prison. Over time, a faction formed within the penitentiary, made up of prisoners who had suffered due to crimes similar to those of Valeria, decided that it would be necessary to take justice into their own hands. They knew that the system had failed to punish adequately and that Valeria would never understand the pain she caused so many families. One day, while the cafeteria was full, the prisoners acted. They surrounded Valeria as she ate. The silence within the room was soon replaced by an atmosphere of growing tension. Without warning or words, they grabbed her violently, quickly immobilizing her. Valeria, although struggling, was unable to fight against so many strong hands. She was brutally tied up and taken to the center of the cafeteria. Panic took over her, but she already knew what was coming. There was no longer any escape. What she did, the crime against her own son, would now be paid for in a way she could never have imagined. The prisoners, without hesitation, dragged her to a large industrial metal pan filled with boiling water. That saucepan, normally used to prepare large quantities of food, would become the instrument of his death. The water bubbled, releasing an unbearable heat that soon began to affect Valeria's skin. The pain began immediately as his body was forced into the casserole dish. The heat from the boiling water quickly burned her flesh, and Valeria, who had previously seemed immune to pain, was now screaming and writhing. But the prisoners surrounding her didn't care. They kept her submerged, not allowing her to escape the unbearable pain. Valeria tried to free herself, but the pain was extreme, and every movement she made only increased her suffering. The hot water penetrated his skin, burning his flesh, and with every second, his resistance became weaker. She started screaming, but no one was there to hear. The punishment she had caused to so many now came back to her in a brutal and painful form. The smell of burning meat quickly spread throughout the cafeteria. Valeria's screams were muffled by the strength of the prisoners holding her. The air was heavy, thick, with heat emanating from the pan, while Valeria, little by little, lost her strength. Her body, now unrecognizable, was being destroyed by the boiling water, as pain became the only sensation she could feel. Death was not quick. It was slow, torturous and merciless, reflecting everything Valeria had done to other people throughout her life. When the prisoners finally removed her from the casserole, Valeria was already dead, her body burned beyond recognition. The blood and heat of the boiling water had finished what she started with her own hands. Her death was an act of revenge and justice, something she could never have predicted, because even inside prison, no one was safe from the brutality of the justice system that prisoners decided to apply when the system failed. Valeria Martinez's name would never be forgotten in Cárcel de la Muerte. His death was not just an execution, it was a lesson that, no matter how much power someone has outside prisons, inside them, everyone is vulnerable, and no one escapes the consequences of their crimes. These three stories portray the tragic and brutal fates of women who faced the brutality of Mexico's penitentiaries. Valeria Soto, Sofia Herrera and Valeria Martinez, each with their own merciless crimes, saw their fates sealed within the prison walls. They have experienced the terror and violence of a system where revenge, pain and death do not distinguish between age or sex. The execution of each of them, whether at the hands of other prisoners or the consequences of their own actions, reflects what can happen when hatred and fear become so intense. These stories, while fictional, serve as a reminder of how ruthless justice can be within these walls and the price some pay for their crimes. If you were impacted by these reports and want to see more intense stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more videos. Share with your friends and leave your comment below, telling us what you think of these stories. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more content like this. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.